Palingenesis by Simon Hereward. Book 2, Darkening Tide. Chapter 13. First Blow. Rasgent held out his hands towards the fire. How cold it had been this rhyme song past, and yet the chill lingered as if it had found a resting place in his very bones. A guard stepped into the room to announce a visitor. He did not turn to see who it was, he knew already. Of all the Sea Raven lords assembled in Kilvest, there would be only one who would see him before the council was to meet.
Captain Zebar is here, my lord.
Rasgent nodded slowly.
Show him in.
He wished his hands would not shake so badly. What would the man think if he saw it? Quickly he turned to meet the captain, hiding his hands behind his back.
Something that can't wait till the council, Captain Zebar.
The bearded man smiled at him, his teeth showing.
We know each other well enough not to play these games, Lord Rasgent. I would know which side you support. There is no need to be embarrassed before the others.
Rasgent stiffened. It had come to this then. In this seemingly casual confrontation, he was to be overthrown without a struggle. Of course it had already been decided. This was but the unpleasant climax.
I will take the Sea Raven fleet to Heron Inrath, as was agreed.
Zebar pursed his lips. Slowly he shook his head, keeping his eyes fastened on the man in front of him.
Have you ever seen Malikilian City, Nunmerik, my lord? The city by the lake, which men call Lakeside. Have you seen the might of his forces, the wealth and power of his nobles? He is not a man to withstand, my lord.
Rasgent was grave.
And Garth? Is he a man to ignore?
Zebar changed his line of attack.
You are a king in your own right, Lord Rasgent. Lords and powers like Malikilian and Karth have never had regard for the likes of us. We are but cattle to them, slaves.
He emphasized the last word and saw his lord flinch. Rasgent had spent his childhood as a slave in an Aeronite castle. He had been ill-used, and the memory of it still sickened and enraged him. Zebar continued.
We still have power over the seas. Not even Aaron, with all its sea might, can overcome us in 10 cycles. We should stay out of this affair, my lord. If we choose a side, we have little to gain and a round to lose.
The old man still appeared suspicious.
Is it not that Lord Rune is aligned with Garth, and this is the life of your council?
My lord, you know that I make no secret of my hatred for the Nurian. If he has so little esteem for your realm that he would risk it for some obscure sorcerer, I have not. He has come from outside, and I understand that he cannot hold the Isles in as high regard as those who have known no other home. The favor of kings is fickle and shifts like the wind to fit their advantage. We should see to our own interests and not those of powers who would sacrifice us for their benefit. This is my counsel.
Rasgent knew that it would also be the decision of the Sea Raven captains if there was to be a vote. Zebar had finally secured control over the majority. Others would not risk a confrontation with the man most probable to succeed as overlord. For several seasons he had been reigning in name only. They both knew it. He made one more feeble attempt.
I have a tryst to keep. What of that?
Zebar leaned in closer.
And we shall keep it.
His eyes betrayed the hunger, the latent power of the next Sea Raven lord. Rasgent could already feel the snapping teeth of the younger wolf close around his throat. Goramul was bursting at the seams. More than 3,000 huts had been added to the metropolis during the last 10 days of the cycle. Rivers of armed men, some with their families in tow, flowed from the corners of the Southland realm into the lake of the capital. Saving the untamable people of the Teeth across the western river Itu, all the nations of the South had united at last under a single banner. Now they were gathering in brotherhood and celebration of their strength. A sea of pens had been erected to hold the hundreds of pigs, cattle, and wildfowl to be slaughtered for the war feast. Long huts were lined with uncountable clay pots containing helna, the potent brew meant for consumption during the darkening feasts, believed to aid the warrior in finding his place of equilibrium. Drums throbbed day and night, mingled with the keening songs of tribesmen performing their purification rites. The whole sprawling city seemed to be dancing. A tangible excitement had gripped the people here. In the thronging streets, among the masses of foreigners, chanting in their different dialects and local tongues, groups would leap and twist in an ecstasy of quick-paced movement. There was little motivation or ritualistic sense. Each merely tried to outdo the other in their expression of exhilaration. In days to come, the greater dances would be performed round the offering stones and in the courts of the king. The Darkening Festival was upon them, this cycle to coincide with a war feast. The Gudrid Empire was displaying its combined might and splendor before unleashing the massive conquering horde to subject the western shore of the inland sea. Soon the great arms of Horan Indranag would reach for lands rich and formidable, adding them to the subjected territories of the empire. If their enemies were aware, it mattered not. There was no resisting such a gathering of warriors. It would merely work in their favor if spies reported on the numbers of their host and the direction of their assault, for an enemy learning these things would not resist for long. Their hearts would die within them, and they would search for hiding places rather than stand to strike a blow. Had the entire Southland region not fallen to them? Where were the peoples of the fierce Rethu tribes, if not among them, stretching forth their hands to eat from the same pots, to sit at the same fires, and dance in one formation? Where were the vast numbers of Giri warriors, if not paying tribute and taking the path of war as sworn allies? Now the messenger had arrived to hold back the light of the sun. The days were numbered. Anticipation would build towards the 6th day of darkening. All-night feasts, the rites of passage for youths joining the societies of their tribes, and offerings of animals in increasing worth preceded the day of Horn, the day of blood. All the warriors had to have their purification and fasting completed by then. All the rites would cease, the contests of bravery, the supplications made to priests or nobles. The 5th day would see the display and judging of the sacrifices, till midnight, when they would be taken away to be hidden for the ceremony. Then all of Goramul would hold its breath, waiting for the release of the darkening rite, where the god himself would claim life for the empire. This cycle everything seemed augmented, and of greater stature than ever before. Priests took more care in their blessings. Sacrifices were purer and of greater quality. Warrior societies were far better supported than previously. Everyone could sense the great triumph lying at the door. Everyone would be part of the glory and certain victory. The dance of war possessed the bodies of potters and tree fellers, brickmakers and thatchers, taking up the spear and joining the feast of dead men. They all mimed the striking of the death blow, the claiming of the heart and liver of the conquered enemy. Every Amul had become a warrior to bring back spoils and tales of great deeds. By day 4, the excitement was at fever pitch. This night was the time of lawlessness, where everything was permitted short of murder and mutilation. Men with known enemies disappeared to secret places, not quite sure that the rules would be respected in the general atmosphere of abandon. When the crowd snaked through the streets, intent on mischief and hungry for cruel entertainment, many a hut lay in darkness, the door boarded up and the windows barred. Children slept at relatives or acquaintances on the outskirts of the city. The night was wild and packed with danger. Even more so now that the crowd had multiplied to many times its normal size. The dark dawn saw many bodies about the streets, most of which would not stir again. Gor Amul would spend the day drinking and forgetting, nursing injuries and reveling in shameful memories, that evening to crowd into the palace court for the judgment of the sacrifices. The day turned slowly. The invisible sun slid into the nebulous west. The Lord of the Amul appeared among his expectant subjects as a god. The light of countless torches played over the glittering tunic, the oiled flesh, the strutting, majestic form. What was this prison, this small cage he could not escape? What was the purpose of it, if not to feed one's appetite? Round and round the days flowed in ceaseless patterns of aspirations and disappointments, till one grew sick of the endless gyrations and meaningless games of life and death in its measured cycle. Round again, the bright eye hidden for a few days of respite, before it peered once more round the rim of darkness. Would he ever be rid of its staring accusation? Could a mere man twist the fates and wrench from eternity a portion large enough to fill the void inside? But he was more than a man, and the realization possessed his frame till it was a strain to keep it from drowning him. A power, stolen and secret, here in the presence of so many creatures of pure appetite. He explored the limits of what a frail human body could encapsulate. Here he could break free, too easily, of limitations of mind and reasoning. Raw feeling had the sway, and the cries were songs of primal release, where compassion was a dusty dream, and anything temperate was stripped away. He was the god of this world, to sway and twist what he wished, to decide who lived and who died. And nothing stood before the onslaught of his driving passion, not the thoughts of his own being, or the identity brought here from that far place. There was no restraining his rage, no reins to curb the pouring out of vengeance. His voice was their voice, his desire had become theirs. In the screams, the touch of blades upon their flesh, the flow of willing blood, he was lifted up by the power of their worship. Their will made him strike blow after blow, and the rage flowed from one to another, till they tore themselves with tooth and nail, possessed as he was with a purifying pain. And in the ecstasy of release, the moment of fulfillment, something gave way in him. Horan the consumer felt a sudden suffocating loss of self-awareness. All his thoughts shrank to a tiny point in the dark cylinder of his mind. His head slumped forward, and he grasped the column next to him in reflex to keep from falling. There were whispers from the recesses he had lost, suggestions made to him, loud enough to drown the great tumult of the heaving crowd around him. Frantically, he held on to that pinprick of awareness. Already he could feel the exquisite surge of power as his body changed its form, but he would not give in. He would have it on his terms, regardless of the temptation. In a moment the pressure dissolved. He raised the knife before them once more, shaken but free. Sweat poured from his body. His legs were strangely weak. Trust had done this to him. The curse of forgetful habit. One false step, and he had to crawl about like a worn-out hag forevermore to remain in control. It was a slow poison, working against his will, as if the shepherd's boy was still alive somewhere inside him, in a tender place, inconsumable and separate. Many seasons had passed, but still the struggle was of the same intensity. Would there come a day he could not shake free? Would he be driven into a cage like his firstborn, an enemy of all living things? Malik Yulian, Horan Inrunag, Lord of Taralan, God King of Bor Amul, felt unrestrained fear take hold of him. 2 days passed like a single gloomy hour. Men who had fallen from exhaustion during the rite would wake, eat and drink and sleep once more. The aroma of roasting meat clouded the entire city. The feasting had begun. Malik made no more appearances during the feast. The lapse during the darkening rite had left him moody and dejected, and he could not afford weakness now. It was time to rid himself of Karth's hold on his little rock in the inland sea. Far away to the east, the waste had already given birth to the swarm. The beasts would be in Lysan by now. Soon all the people of the entire eastern shore would be dismayed and scattered, their cities laid waste, their only thought to escape the tide of death and destruction. The knowledge of it was a restorative to his bruised spirit. Across the city of Goramul, the war bands were forming up. The hour of retribution had arrived. He would meet Kale again in a diversionary clash while his hordes brought low the walls of his adversary's stronghold. With any luck, the old fool would be too preoccupied to aid the defenders until it was too late. Once the Amul had landed on the island in sufficient numbers, Malik need not concern himself with it any longer. He would depart for Munborg. Regalia supposedly had something of great value for him. It was the morning of the 9th day of Darkening. Already there was a shift in the perpetual gloom. Formations stood ready throughout the city, lining every street. Now the faces were set in concentration. They were the dead men honored during the feast, now to go out and redeem their lives again with valor. A great shout went up from the temple in the king's court. Every man took it up in turn, till the city shook with it. The drums started, and the tramping of 300,000 feet, the pulse of destiny, an overwhelming power moving out in columns to conquer, to subject, to claim. A single arm swung out northwestwards to where their brethren waited in the Giri Peninsula, there to take the boats for Aran. 3 more tramped through the jungle towards the coast of the inland sea, sweating in the close air, goaded on by the thunder of the drums and the deafening roar of war songs. Hidden in the groves of the swampy coastal plains lay their transports by the hundred, from long boats with room for 30 rowers down to smaller craft that could carry only 10 or 12. Now it was their sunrise, the turning of a new cycle beginning. Drumming and chanting, warriors flocked into the boats, shoving off in haste towards their distant target across the sea. The Gudrid horde, like an arrow released from a tight bowstring, was speeding towards its mark. Panik leaped onto the dockside in Angen with haste born from growing concern. The stink of pitch almost took away his breath. Empty buildings yawned about him forlornly, the black tarry layers spread over them like funeral shrouds. It was as if they knew about their doom and were crying out against it. He made his way swiftly through the deserted quayside structures. Not as much as a shoestring remained here. All the hoarded contents had been transported out of Heron Inrath, to leave but a bare, barren place for the occupying hordes. After the first waves had landed and passed through on their way to the fortress, the docks would be set on fire, trapping some of the invaders inside and leaving them nothing of use after. This was the 4th trip since Millen's return from Munborg, ferrying women and children to prepared hiding places in the remote islands of the Cauldron. They would only have been in the way during the battle to come, and since there was to be no victory, would have made the inevitable evacuation much more difficult. Panik was confident that everything possible had been done to prepare for the unequal contest to come. He crossed the main causeway to Fur at a trot. Above him on the walls towered war machines moved into position now that the waiting was over. His booted steps rang hollow in the enclosed gatehouse. Guards hastily stepped out of his way. The great courtyard still rang with the clash of swords as men sparred to improve their skill. Bowstrings still sang at the far end, while Bior gave some final instruction and advice. Up the stairs he went, through the throne room and down the passage to where the master waited. Even the wall hangings had gone. Fur was an empty shell, with nothing to offer her visitor but the edge of a sword and the point of a spear. Garth was staring into the fire, as he so often did nowadays. Despite his pensive mood, he appeared calm and confident. There was another change Hunnick had not noticed before. Since the assassination attempt, Garth had put on flesh again. His hollow cheeks had frilled out, his arms and hands no longer appeared skeletal. The robe around his shoulders did not sag as it used to. For all one could tell by looking at him, the Lord of Heron Inrath was growing younger.
You have tidings for me?
He motioned to a chair. As always, his foremost captain declined the offer.
We have completed the final run. All the supplies and non-combatants are removed from Heron Inrath.
Garth nodded in satisfaction. With all the clutter out of the way, they could concentrate on the battle itself.
Anything else?
Hunnick moved his feet.
The Sea Ravens are out in force.
Where are they lying?
Off the northeastern shore, out of the way and at a safe distance.
Garth looked at him sharply.
You believe they will betray us?
I believe they have betrayed us. There was no answer to our greeting when we passed them. I had the distinct impression that they led us by with the utmost restraint.
That was just an impression, though.
Hunnick shrugged.
Perhaps, but I have no confidence in these pirates. Earlier, 1 or 2 ships we encountered on the way tried to follow us into the cauldron. I would not be surprised if we go back there once this is over, only to find the entire population removed as slaves for the Sea Ravens.
Garth forced a laugh.
Come now. You don't think they could find our villages there, do you? I give them very specific instructions.
If they believe themselves safe, those silly women may just follow their own counsel and make their cooking fires in plain sight or during the daytime. You can be sure there are ravens cruising about the cauldron right about now.
You think they will interfere with the evacuation?
I do not know if they are willing to dirty their hands at this stage. Attacking boatloads of soldiers would not bring much plunder for the losses they are bound to take. But yes, they might very well interfere. Perhaps it will be different after they have seen the numbers of Malik's barbarians.
Garth considered this carefully. It irked him that the portal veil was under his control, and he could not use it for this simple task. His entire force could have made a quick and clean escape from the island. But now there was no feasible exit from the valley. The tower door was closed, and he would not force it. Aaron had set up defenses to prevent use of their gate. Belruth was impossible for now and potentially hostile. Arius lay in the path of the swarm. A question from Hunnick brought him back to the room.
What of Malik? Will he merely stand and watch the invasion? Will he not attempt some interference to prevent you from stirring up the sea against his craft?
Garth was sure of the answer.
He will make his move through the portal veil. If he can put warriors inside the fortress, we will not last long.
Hunnick looked at him imploringly.
Lord Karth, once again I must urge you to consider closing the veil. You would be worth 10,000 men to us, if you were not occupied there.
Garth sighed.
I cannot do it, Hunnick. I was warned about the veil. It cannot be closed just yet.
Who warned you? The boy?
No, the seer.
Ephraim lifted his tired gaze to the horizon once more. His eyes were scratchy and sensitive, as if they had sand in them. He knew he had to get some sleep. The captain was no use to anyone with impaired judgment brought on by extreme fatigue. Yet he was loath to leave his place of duty. The responsibility of leading the Aronite battle fleet was severe enough without the added pressure of evading a superior enemy in the dangerous waters of the Witch Sea.
Sail to starboard!
The watchman in the mainmast rigging sang out the warning. Evrain cupped his hands round his eyes. It was difficult to make out the colors in the half-dark, but the shape was unmistakable. It had to be Davin and these boys. It had been his idea to employ the faster fishing boats as scouts for the fleet. He had picked the more able keel captains and sent up and down the coast for men he could trust. Men like Fiad of Ambervent and Davin of the Rock. Even Bolred, who at first would not speak to him out of envy, had eventually agreed to join the operation. Evrain smiled to himself. A brush with foreigners would do that old fogey nothing but good. Davin's boat, the Daystar, sped towards them before a stiff breeze. The crew worked energetically to haul in the mainsail as they closed up. Evrain raised a hand in greeting. He cupped his hands round his mouth to be heard above the rushing wind.
What news?
Davin, dressed like the rest of his crew in a pale blue rayon, made his report.
3 ships to the east, 5 miles. Not sure if they spotted us. Worked our way around.
He waved an arm.
To their rear. Many more there. Perhaps 25 or 30.
Evrain whistled through his teeth. The main enemy fleet was on their doorstep. It was a good thing they had the strong wind in their favor. The Sea Ravens were not likely to beat in against it, and rowing would be difficult in the high swell. He merely had to keep on the southerly course to steer clear of them. He turned to the sergeant at his side.
Signal the rest of the fleet to maintain present course. All transport should remain well to the windward.
Yes, sir.
The man stepped over to the signal pennants. Evrain turned back to the Daystar, still cruising off their starboard bow.
Davin, take a look in front for signs of our allies.
He saw the youth nod and wave. Orders rang out on board his boat, and the sail was hoisted again. Smartly they turned away to catch the full force of the breeze. Onward they plowed through the walls of water. Evrain turned from the command post to retire to his cabin, leaving strict instructions to wake him if there was any change in status. Perhaps he could snatch a few hours of uninterrupted sleep. With the Sea Ravens accounted for, there should not be any encounter of note till they reached Heron Inrath. His sleep was not to be untroubled after all. Confused dreams swirled through his mind. His previous skirmish with the Witch Sea, the fog and freak wave, the loss of his mast, all followed one another in rapid succession. When at last he broke out of the turmoil to full wakefulness, he had a vivid image in his thoughts. The body of the Nurian boy was floating in the water, his eyes set in death, the broken cord of the silver victory medallion dangling from his lifeless hand. A pale, sickly sun rose on the first day of Genesis 599. Free at last of Pelea's deathly embrace, it promised light and life to the world again. It was the season for rebirth, the awakening of the growing green from the bedding ground of the soil, the spreading of fragile life, to be nurtured by the touch of warmth so long absent. Dewdrops nestled in the unfurling leaves and buds of vineyard and pasturage, capturing the brilliant golden alchemy of the first rays of the new cycle. What wonders were about to unfold here? What vital beauty and charm would be unlocked in the days to come? Anik looked down at his face reflected in a tiny pool on the high wall of fur. He could hear the songs of birds. It was Myrday, Day, the first of the 10-day, of Genesis and of the cycle. A day for promises, new beginnings, festivity. He reached up to adjust the catch of his helm. The reflection reached with him. The fellow next to him shifted his feet. They were nervous, these defenders of fur, but resolute. Lining the walls and ramparts of the ancient fortress, men of all ages awaited the first sighting of their enemy. Each man had a stout bow, 2 bundles of arrows, a bite to eat later on, and a 5th share in a water skin. The fighting was expected to last all day and perhaps into the night. No one knew whether the enemy would relent during the hours of darkness. Away on the eastern horizon, something pierced the morning haze. A dark spot seemed to break free of the paleness and take on a proper shape. Others followed, crowding in behind it, spreading in its wake to left and right. The invasion fleet had been spotted. Almost immediately, a severe fog stood up from the sea. The dots were covered in swirling gray vapors and soon disappeared. A cheer broke from the men of fur. Men smiled and stood down, slapping one another on the back. The Witch Sea was a formidable ally. Onyx smiled with the rest. At least Garth had found time to confuse the first wave of the assault. It was a token resistance, but the men would take heart at the sight of such power, and not see the vastness of the enemy host from afar. There would be no hindrance for their machines either, for the fog stayed clear of the beaches and was moving out to sea with the breeze. The missiles could be launched in the dark anyway, for every stone within reach had been marked and the distance measured. He loosened his helm and took it off. The first attack was going to be a broken-up affair, easy to repulse. Perhaps the firing of the dockyard could wait till a more concerted effort was made. He placed the helm on a pile of loose stone and motioned to an errand boy.
Fetch us a basket of apples, my good lad. We have a little time to relax.
The Amul host plunged into the sudden surge of fog without faltering. They had been warned that the waters around Heron Inrath could be tricky. Soon it was impossible to determine where the other boats were. The drumming seemed to come from all around, sometimes from so close by that it was odd not to see another vessel there. All one could do was to keep going forward without slowing down. The masses behind would not waver. Changes in course or speed could result in collisions and chaos. The sun disappeared. The chants had changed in fashion and urgency. Those who knew it sang the mariner's mantra to calm the waves and disperse the clinging fog. Boats in front increased their speed slightly without realizing it, fear of being struck from behind working on them. Those to the rear hung back, not being able to judge the distance to the boats in front of them. Soon the invaders spread out at both ends of the armada, while the middle fell into chaos. Cries of anger and surprise echoed through the gray swirl as near collisions were averted at the last moment. With no sun to steer by and no leader to follow, helmsmen could not correct their courses and were veering off track. Still, the surge could not be halted. There was no way to issue a command that would allow all the boats to regroup and reform their loose formation. A captain standing in the prow of his vessel could not see any other commander, or even the boats carrying the men under his command. All he could hope for was to reach the island and find his warriors on the shore. Evrain and his men watched the fog rise with horror. Certainly the defenses of the Witch Isle would not be deployed against them. If the waters were stirred, would they not also founder? Quickly he ordered the ships to close up and reduce sail. Each one was to stay within hailing distance of the next for as long as the fog lasted. Fearful memories came to him. He ordered the men to move in silence, listening for anything out of place. Perhaps they could turn the ships in time to meet the wave head-on. They drifted before the wind for most of the morning, before the gray blanket showed any signs of dissipating. Only when he could see the masts of the rearmost ship of their squadron did Evrain breathe a sigh of relief. There would be no wave on their side of the island. Perhaps the sudden fog had also simply been a natural thing. There were almost simultaneous cries from the lookouts on the 3 leading ships. An unexpected sight greeted them. Off the port, a foreign vessel had appeared, the occupants of which were as astonished to see them. It was a war canoe, crammed with warriors bound for Heron Inrath. There was no sign of any of its companions in the empty sea to the east. Instead of beating a hasty retreat, the leading warrior ordered his men to loose arrows at the Aronites. Evrain's men lined the bulwarks and launched theirs in return. This proved fatal to the exposed barbarians at such close quarters. Not an uninjured man remained to attempt an escape. The slow-moving Aeronite vessels surrounded the stricken craft and dragged several captives on board. The Amul had their wounds seen to before being tied up and delivered to Bolred's crew for transportation back to Arran. He would let Raelf deal with these specimens. Perhaps there was some information to be gleaned from them. Now that the weather had cleared, they could see the outlines of Heron Inrath on the horizon. A pall of heavy smoke was spreading over it. Already the island was on fire. Hunnick allowed the first scattered canoes to spill their contents onto Yura Beach. He had gathered 300 of his most able men in the hills to await the first wave. 50 more stood by to torch the canoes as they landed. Even though these tactics would expose his men directly to the enemy, Hunnick believed that a quick strike against the overconfident barbarians would lower the morale of the next wave significantly. The Inrathians waited till clumps of warriors started moving across the beach. The moment had arrived. At the signal, the defenders stood up from their concealment and launched a flight of arrows. The Amul had expected some sort of resistance and surged forward, leaving behind dozens of dead and wounded. 2 more flights greeted them before the Inrathians exchanged bows for spears and swords. They charged from the high ground, pushing back the wavering enemy with ease. Within moments, the outnumbered Amul were fleeing back to the sea. Now Hunnick's reserves moved in, casting their pots of flaming pitch into the stranded canoes. A ragged cheer went up from the islanders. The beach was littered with dead and dying enemies. Black smoke rose from the hulks of 13 canoes. A few survivors were swimming away from the shore towards the still approaching horde. With the element of surprise forfeited, Hunnick did not try the same ploy again. The next group would not be so careless as to leave a number isolated from the main force. They would bunch dozens of canoes together and drive them onto the beach at the same time. Soon there would also be a landing made in the port. It was time to fall back on the fortress. Not a man had sustained serious injuries during the skirmish. There were a few cuts and bruises, quickly attended to once they were inside the gates. There were shouts of victory in the camp and high spirits. At least the men had something to cheer about before the real work began. Garth felt the presence of his adversary even before the first enemy vessel was sighted. Deliberately, he let Malik linger in the Vale. How the Shadow would wonder at his silence. It gave him pleasure to think of the other as puzzled and uncertain. Where was Kale? What was he up to? Did he plan some kind of ambush? Was it safe to send in a pathetic little priest or two? So there was time to play a little game with the invaders. Hunnick would have his opportunity of an early strike. He deserved to have the odds in his favor for a while. Let him show Malik the real worth of his horde. He sighed a little to leave the battle so early, but Malik would get up to mischief sooner or later if left unattended. The deceiver had perched himself on top of the stone marker, as if he owned the place. There was a hint of anger which Kale stifled immediately. The move had been meant to upset him. He smiled inwardly to see the Shadow's annoyance at the sight of him. The mask of scorn and derision slipped back into place as Malik rose to meet him.
What? Come to test your strength once more?
Malik's laugh was hollow.
This is the hour of my triumph, and there is nothing you can do about it.
Overconfidence has ever been your greatest asset, Viper.
We shall see, old man.
There was a vicious clash of resolve. Kale half hoped the slithering worm would forget himself and face him for once. But Malik had memories of his recent weakness too vivid to ignore. He shied away almost immediately.
How long will your refugees last against real warriors? Have you seen the forces I've brought to your doorstep?
Kale was prepared for this obvious initial thrust. He countered swiftly.
You have much to learn about the qualities of men, and their uses in battle.
Laughter again, light and mocking.
Bow to the inevitable. Your feeble preparations are in vain. Your plans are all known to me.
A cruel smile appeared on Malik's face.
I have taken your spies in Manborg. Nothing will come of your scheming there.
It was no lie. Kale knew it in his heart. His champion was lost to him. A cold certainty settled over him. The Shadow Lord felt something of his hidden anguish. He smelled the blood of a first wound. Now, to play it carefully, wear down the massive strength of his opponent's will. He changed his tone to an almost soothing croon.
Why would one strive for the good of creatures with so little to recommend them? And you're supposed to be the tough soldier. Look at you, worn out in a futile effort to protect and nurture them. Where is your dignity? You are crawling under the burden of their weakness. Can you not see how degrading it is? Why do you not let them slip into the destitution they so richly deserve?
Kale knew he should not argue with this twister. Already images of past hurts and failures were crowding into his thoughts. Soon his resolve would start to crumble, and the issues of right and wrong, the places where he was strong, would no longer come to mind. Yet part of him kept admitting that what the other was saying was true. Malik hunched his shoulders and leaned forward as if he was looking for a place to strike the next blow.
Have you considered your so-called allies? Have you observed their fumbling in the Lysan affair? I played one and then the other. Where is Borgrest of Lysan? In his grave, cursing the Nurians who eagerly betrayed him as soon as I suggested it. Where is Tregaran of Ligeria? A prisoner in his own house, crossed by his own nephew and his closest ally. Where is Turik, who would rule in his place? A trickster tricked by the Nurians he trusted, cursing the turncoats of which he is the chiefest. And these men would be your shield against the swarm.
Kale swept aside the arguments. Nothing was claimed that he did not know already.
Your trickery will come home to you one day. Not everyone can be deceived so easily.
More mocking laughter. Malik seemed genuinely amused.
Oh, their greed, their self-interest, their lecherous, covetous, insatiable ambitions will vanish overnight. Every man can be led by the nose if you offer him what he thinks he wants. Is that not so?
He paused to rub his chin.
That the precious Veer could father such a miserable lot.
Kale's lunge was inspired by anger and easily avoided. Malik was beginning to enjoy himself. He had all the advantages, and Nurians had always been Kale's weakest point. He moved in a little closer.
Fengor has played into my hands as well. His little army stands ready to take on the Ligerians.
He laughed scornfully.
What a clash that would be! The inept Nurians against their cowardly neighbors. Something to behold. The petty Turik is no more decisive than his predecessor. There would have been little left for the swarm to consume.
Kale struck back with the first thing that came to mind. Some effort would have to be made, or the fiend would keep him off balance forever. He had little use for these games.
You admit it then. The swarm is of your making, and all those before it.
Oh my! Old Kale is catching on at last. But no, the very first one was a freak of nature. I merely recreated the conditions under which such a spectacular event takes place. Of course, I helped it along here and there, especially when it comes to the timing.
Why so open all of a sudden? Are you not the man of secrets?
After I've killed you, Kale, you will come back knowing nothing. What use will all this knowledge be if you cannot remember any of it? I will find you again, knowing what I do, in the world of my own making. Then you will die again for my sport and that of my queen, and we will be free of your blundering stupidity for another 100 cycles.
A world of your making. What could a dark tyrant like you offer Myril? The people of the Inland Sea would never bow to you and your warped ways. They are not all as easily seduced as the Southland savages.
Have I not told you before? I have seen them bow, in miserable fear, in lowly greed, and they will bow. And even if they did not, what would prevent me from simply feeding them to my pets?
Like you have been doing in the Dankwood.
The moment he said it, Kale knew that the blow had gone home. Malik hid the look of consternation almost immediately, but the damage was done. Frantically, his agile mind searched for an explanation. How could Kale be aware of that dark place? No slave had ever escaped it. No spy ever penetrated it. Or had one? Was Kale even sure, or had it been a guess? How much did he know? The uncertainty made him vulnerable. He felt the closing of the other's thoughts, the suffocating power reaching out for him. Words poured from his mouth, no longer carefully selected as before, but desperate and out of place.
You have tried to warn the Aaronites, to prepare them for the invasion, but it will not save them, even if they can beat off this horde. I will strike at them with the Sea Raven fleet, deny them ocean passage and trade. My armies will move through the pass and clear the remaining rats from their nest.
Yes, the Aaronites have been warned. They know about your little insurrection in the mounds. They know about your treachery, about your dark dealings with the swarm, about your twisted monsters. I have sent them word. They are aware of your schemes.
Monsters? I have no idea.
Oh, but you do. Shall I describe it to you? Do you think I'm not aware of what happened on the field when you faced Fenwith? Do you believe I'm not aware that that was your doing?
Malik took several steps backwards. It could not be possible. Had he underestimated Kale after all? Madness took hold of him. His laughter was near hysterical.
That was a little kitten. Do you think I have not perfected my methods during all this time of preparation? That toothpick will not avail you now.
Kale seemed almost not to notice the change of tone. He kept probing as if they were engaged in a friendly chat.
So, you know where it is?
I know, and you will never find it.
You have hidden it. Why would you hide it if there is no longer any threat?
Malik did not reply directly. He was in trouble and he knew it. Something eluded him. There was a thread he could not unravel. A spy had slipped through his defenses. Who was it? What had he learned? Something was out of place. A Nurian living in the Isles, trading in Lakeside itself, reporting to the King of Arran, visiting with the irksome Vadran in Fenvale. A memory of Kale's reaction at the outset of their conversation returned.
It's this Prince Rune of yours. Do not think I am unaware of him. He has fed you these blind exaggerations.
Kale steeled himself. The asp would not slither away now.
What exaggerations? About the beast or the blade? Or perhaps about the Dankwood?
Malik forced himself to calm down. Kale had to be guessing, and yet he was too close to the truth to be entirely ignorant. He was losing the contest. It was time to withdraw. Surely the invaders had landed their craft by now. He held on to the only advantage left him.
I have him in Munborg, and I will break him and take his strength, as I should have done that day he crawled into Lakeside.
Kale ignored the thrust. He had the upper hand now.
What makes you think that you are a match for me?
Malik was already wavering, playing for time.
Match? Your underestimating is as feeble as your pretended valor. I am merely keeping you here while my forces breach your barrier of fog.
And you think since the last time I am not aware of that ploy?
Doubt, at last, breached the slippery defenses of the adversary. Malik felt the pressure. Hate boiled in him. If he lingered any longer, he would be trapped and broken.
Have your laugh, old man. It will not last long.
Down the path he fled, a swirling, elusive shape of cloaked darkness. Kale sighed deeply and sat down next to the marker. A dull ache had settled in his temples. He was mortally tired of these games. Whatever use Veer still had for the veil, he hoped it was worth the effort. The 3 Raven vessels Davin had sighted during the last days of Darkening scouted ahead of their main fleet shortly after the lifting of the fog. Once again it was the Daystar that brought tidings of their whereabouts. Though the breeze was much lighter than before, the speed of the expertly handled boat seemed hardly diminished as they sidled up to the bulk of the warship. Evrain did not like the situation. The Sea Ravens had not aided the Inrothians and opposed the invasion in any way. Surely they were no longer to be trusted or considered allies. What were they doing here in the Witch Sea? Would they attempt to destroy Karth's forces when the latter tried to make their escape from the island? This was quite possible. He should therefore consider them hostile and use every opportunity to neutralize the threat they posed. Yet he had to keep them away from his own transports in the process. How to deal then with these approaching scouts? He could cruise to within spotting range and show them his 9 warships. Would that not merely give away his strength and position? But they would keep pushing until contact was made sooner or later. Should he attempt their capture? What if the main fleet chanced upon them while he was embroiled in hand-to-hand combat with the pirates? The conditions no longer favored a quick escape. Oared vessels had the advantage over shorter distances. He dispatched the Daystar to keep an eye on the enemy vessels. The Aeronite fleet would have to maintain its position to be of any use to the Inrothians. If they retreated now to avoid detection, there would be no role to play in the battle for Heron Inrath. Let the scouts take a look at them. The cowardly Sea Ravens might just decide to keep their distance or sail for home. Davin was hardly out of hailing distance when the masts of the enemy ships were spotted by the lookouts.
Vessels to port. 3 ships.
Evrain looked up at the man.
Ravens!
Sea Raven galleys, sir. Single masters. Perhaps 2 rowing decks. Steering to intercept.
Lur was at his elbow. He nodded slowly.
60 rowers apiece, and perhaps 40 fighting men. They would make an excellent prize.
Evrain agreed.
They would, if the rest of their fleet, for some mysterious reason, decided not to support them.
The older man sighed.
We leave them be then.
We leave them be, for now.
The enemy vessels seemed to be slowing. They had obviously spotted the Aeronite fleet. Davin still bore down on them. As they watched, he changed course to give them a wide berth. The 2 squadrons approached tentatively. The Sea Ravens did not change course. Soon the rhythmic beating of their drums could be heard. Davin changed tack to beat into the wind towards his ships. As soon as he came about, the orders rang out on board the pirate vessels, and the drumbeat quickened. Lur stared in amazement.
What are they doing?
The galleys sped forward, slicing through the water. Davin hesitated, uncertain about their intentions. Evrain swore under his breath.
Turn! Get the wind in your sails!
Lur gripped the port rail and leaned forward.
The bastards are going to take him. Where have you seen such nerve? Right under our noses.
It seemed to be the case. The show of impertinence by the slavers shocked everyone into inactivity. This open show of hostility and contempt was entirely unexpected. Lur grabbed hold of his sleeve and proceeded to shake it violently. His voice cut through the indecision.
Are you going to let them be taken?
No, he was not.
Hard to port! Battle formation! Prepare the boarding parties!
Now that it could not be avoided, he was relieved to be going into action against the Sea Ravens. The history of the Aeronite battle fleet was one of avoiding confrontation with its more powerful counterpart in the Isles. There were jokes enough about these fine soldiers who never drew their swords in anger except to brawl in portside taverns. After today, the tongues would have different yarns for their fireside entertainment. It seemed inevitable that the Daystar would be overwhelmed in front of their eyes. The young boys on board the fishing boat appeared to be paralyzed with fear, hares staring at the wolves bearing down on them. Evrain fretted at the slow turning of the cumbersome warship. If he was to survive the war, there would be changes made to the design. Davin was jumping about like a crazy thing. Arrows from the slaver ships were thudding into the boat around him. Perhaps the pirates were not aiming to take the boat as a prize. It seemed they were only intent on slaughtering the crew in front of the onrushing Aeronites. In desperation, Davin ordered his crew over the side of the Daystar. He lingered a moment to cut a rope and followed them. The mainsail of his vessel had gone slack, flapping uselessly in the breeze. Arrows still poured down on them from the decks of the charging ravens, but now the Aaronites kept their heads down behind the hull of their boat. There were shouts of rage and indignation from the warships. The cowardly attack on a small, unarmed boat was nothing short of an atrocity, and the fact that it was being perpetrated within sight of the victim's countrymen multiplied the severity of the offense. Every man on board the Aaronite warships willed their vessels forward. Archers lined the bulwarks with their half-drawn bows, waiting for the command. It could not come soon enough. At last, the Sea Ravens altered their course away from the stricken fishing boat. They had not quite reached it in time to complete their attack. It was clear that the enemy commander was reluctant to end the fun before they could ram and sink the little vessel. He turned his galleys in a deliberately provoking and leisurely way, a little too leisurely. Evrain's ships had gained the full advantage of the following wind. Before the slavers' sails were properly unfurled, the charging Aaronites were among them. Now there was alarm and fear written on the erstwhile smug countenances of the Sea Ravens. Sharp orders were barked. The drums quickened their pace. It was too late. Volleys of arrows streaked from the warships into the pirate ranks. Evrain shouted instructions to the archers on the foredeck.
Aim for their drummers! Do not injure the rowers, they are slaves!
A furious, if one-sided archery duel ensued. One by one the drums fell silent, throwing the Sea Raven rowers into confusion. Since these were slaves and had no reason to fear the attackers, they soon stopped rowing altogether. The slavers slowed to a crawl. By the time grappling hooks were thrown across to their ships, the Sea Ravens had little fight left in them. More than half the fighting men were dead or wounded. The remainder surrendered sullenly. Lur shook a fist at them.
Put him overboard. Let him swim for shore.
Others took up the cry, though a few voices made worse suggestions. Evrain waved them to silence.
Put them in chains and cast them into the hold. They are going back to the rock to serve Captain Rail.
There was laughter at this and catcalls. The slavers would feel it on their own hides now. Evrain turned to his sergeant.
Inform those slaves that I will grant them freedom here and now if they will join us. Those who refuse will remain chained to their oars. Either way, they will have to row still. But if they join, they will not have to go down with their ships. There will also be a share in any loot taken if they fight for us, as well as a passage wherever they wish at the end of hostilities.
Davin and his crew had crawled back on board their boat. They appeared to be unhurt, already spreading out their wet clothes on the deck. The sailor rushed up to Evrain to bring the report of casualties. He glanced at the hastily scribbled note. 11 of their archers had been hit, 5 were fatally wounded. Of all the men who had boarded the enemy vessels, only 3 had sustained injuries. It was a substantial victory. The dreaded shout from the lookout interrupted his thoughts. "Sails to port!" All heads swiveled towards the east. A line of vessels crept into view. There was no mistaking to whom they belonged. Urgent orders flowed from the captain.
Release those grapples! 2 men to a rope! Quickly now!
He turned about.
Sergeant!
Lur answered.
He's on the galley. There.
Evrain fixed his eyes on Lur.
Go tell him to get those rowers moving. It is enough for them that they are running for their lives. We can explain the details later. The galleys are to form up in the rear, full sails. Let them pick a drummer from among themselves.
He turned back to the rails. The Daystar was close by.
Davin! Can you sail?
The youth snapped an arrow he had retrieved from the deck planking in half.
The Daystar is undamaged, sir.
Evrain waved an arm in the direction of their trailing transports.
Make haste! Get those boats to safety. Take them around the southern rim of the island if you have to.
He turned back to watch the progress of the enemy fleet. Had he not foreseen this peril before they had closed with the scouting ships? Here now he had risked his entire squadron to save a single boat. Would it prove to be a huge blunder? The fleet would have to turn away in a southwesterly direction to make use of the wind. Evrain drummed impatiently on the bulwark with his fingers. Men were shouting and swearing, playing out more rope to release the tension on the steel grappling hooks. Why did they not merely cut the infernal ropes? Bodies splashed over the sides of the galleys. Could that not be done at a later stage? Perhaps he should leave the prizes behind. If the enemy ships ordered a charge now. He decided to remain in position with his flagship and allow every other vessel to pass behind him. If the slaver galleys closed up to them, he would give the order to scatter and try to lure the majority of the attackers after him. That way, the largest number would be able to escape. Maybe his vessel could outrun the enemy. Maybe. At last, the ships were free to maneuver. Evrain could make out the markings on the enemy ship's pennants by now. Bloodthirsty images of decapitated heads and staked corpses fluttered in the breeze. He counted 31 vessels in all, most of them larger than the scout ships. Could he hear the drumbeats? Had they quickened their pace? 2 ships had passed behind him. It had been a mistake to attack the enemy vessels. There was not enough time to get everyone away safely. He was about to pay for his audacity.
Archers, to your positions!
Men scrambled forward to man the bulwarks.
Ballista ready!
Ready, sir.
Behind him he heard the straining of ropes as the war machine swiveled into position.
Light her up!
Smoke billowed behind him as the deck brazier was lit. With luck they might set 1 or 2 of the lead galleys on fire. In the resulting confusion, there was still hope of slipping away. The captured galleys had formed up behind these retreating ships. The enemy drumbeats were clear now, still only cruising towards the waiting Aeronite. Evrain saw the scores of archers, the boarding parties at the ready. He turned to Lur.
You should have stayed on the rock, Lur. It turns out to be the safest place after all. Today we give our lives for Aaron and the king.
Lur did not reply. Grimly he gripped the hilt of his sword. And then the miracle happened. Instead of ordering the charge as expected, the Sea Ravens altered course sharply, beginning the turn that would take them back in the direction from which they had come.
What in the name of...
Sails off the starboard bow, sir.
Eyes turned away from the Sea Raven fleet and its astonishing maneuver. Evrain and his men stared out to where the lookout had directed them. Another surprising sight unfolded before them. 6 ships were beating in against the wind from the southwest, under full sail. The graceful lines and tall masts were unlike anything he had seen before. All the mainsails were dyed dark purple, and the bows rose up from the sea like the long necks of water birds. Who were they? He ordered the canvas spread and the brazier extinguished. The men stood about the deck, shaking their heads and congratulating one another. What a stroke of good fortune! Evrain stared at his lifelong friend, as incredulous as the rest.
They would have had us, Lur. This is Providence at work.
The Enrothian vessels, for that was what they were, turned out to be quite empty, apart from the few sailors it took to man the rigging. Every available man was still committed to the defense of Fur. There were none to be spared for naval combat. The squadron captain came on board Evrain's ship, where he was welcomed with great enthusiasm. Evrain wanted to know how it came about that he happened by at the exact moment they needed assistance, but the man was evasive in his reply. All he would say was that such seemingly fortuitous interventions were their usual way of operating. Small fleets had to have good intelligence. Lur was about to tell him what he thought of such uncannily accurate information when Evrain interrupted him.
Why did they retreat? Victory was certain if they had been a little bolder.
The Enrothian captain smiled.
You faced them. You did not turn to run, and they could see you were prepared to slug it out to the last man. When we appeared, it all seemed too tough a proposition.
But even with your 6 ships and the 3 prizes, we had scarcely half their number.
They are not here to fight the war. All they want is easy prey, the kind that has no ability to fight back.
Evrain returned the smile at last. He held out a hand to the stranger who had probably saved their skins this day.
Well, Captain, with your timely arrival, you have won yourself an evacuation fleet.
Torrents of dark bodies were streaming over the beach and over the low dunes of Yura, clogging the pathways leading inland to the fortress. They were angry, beating on their shields, chanting their war songs with venomous energy. The milling about and confusion in the fog out at sea had dampened their enthusiasm. The bodies of their comrades strewn along the beach, the smoking hulks of war canoes that had greeted them as they stepped ashore, did not bode well for the coming fight. The dockyard was filled to overflowing. Tramping, dancing figures pressed one another up the ramps and over the wooden walkways, past the empty warehouses and dwellings, working towards the towering walls of the stone fortress above. There was no room for anyone to pass through. Ladders were passed from hand to hand overhead, floating on the sea of people. The Amul swarmed inland, to within range of the defenders' heavier weapons. Over the tumult now could be heard the recoil of the ballistae and catapults. Masonry and broken rock, barrels of burning pitch that burst on impact, spraying those close by with unquenchable fire. Bolts like beams, cutting swathes through the enemy ranks, streamed over the outer wall, till Fur appeared to have come alive and was striking blows in its own defense. Anik watched the masses form up for the initial charge. Hundreds of dead were piled up before the walls, but it did not seem to impede the preparations in any way. It was indeed an irresistible force thrown at them, so recklessly. He looked up at the waters of the bay, still covered as far as the eye could see, with vessels of war seeking to land on their shore. Already there was no more space at the mooring in the port. War canoes were backed up 9 or 10 deep, with warriors leaping from one to the other to gain the quayside. Now was as good a time as any. The advanced elements of the enemy host had spread over the entire island. They crawled through the deserted villages, the empty fields, the copses and meadows like so many ants. Commands rang out, war cries resounded over the land from shore to shore, and the great rush moved forward to the outer wall of Fur. Almost immediately, Anik gave the order to loose the fire bolts from the dockside aimed ballistae. Away streaked the smoke trails of the heavy missiles. They waited breathlessly. The pitch-daubed walls of the dockside buildings splintered under the impact and burst into flame. At first there was little reaction from the massed warriors there. In moments, however, the wooden structures were blazing ferociously, and fire was spreading to the piers and adjacent buildings. There were screams and shouts of alarm. Those who had just landed tried to leap back into the boats, but the press of bodies prevented them. A rush ensued to clear the port. The only way out of the inferno was forward and upward towards the fortress wall. It did not take long for chaos to erupt. The mass surged forward, but not quickly enough for those trapped in the fire. They felt the hot breath at their backs and lost all control. Clawing and shoving, they trampled the fallen underfoot. Many used their weapons in a futile attempt to clear the way. An anguished howl had risen over the dockyard. Out in front, the assault was a bloody affair. The front ranks were soon mired in pits and traps, falling under the deathly rain of arrows and larger missiles from above. Yet so great were their numbers that the attack was carried to the wall almost without interruption. Bodies, maimed and dying, filled in the pits over which their comrades leaped and clambered, unaffected by the sights of such slaughter. Right to the base of the wall they rushed. Swiftly they set up their ladders, tightened the anchor ropes, and started their ascent. Warriors fell stricken to be replaced by 2 others before their bodies had stopped twitching. It was a tide of dark-limbed bodies, shouting, snarling, unstoppable. On the wall, fear gripped the defenders. Sergeants could barely be heard above the din, directing volleys of arrows, encouraging the faltering, calling for helpers to drag back the wounded. A rain of barbarian missiles had descended on the soldiers of Fur. Their shields, held overhead by young boys or wounded companions, were riddled with feathered shafts. The clattering of arrowheads on the stone battlements reminded Hanik oddly of the pounding of hailstones. He signaled to the trumpeter to sound the drawing of swords. The barbarians had almost reached the top of the wall. Clear above the terrific noise of battle rang the 3 silver notes, repeated over and over by trumpeters further along the battlements. Hanik's 4 sentries kept the gatehouse. Their weapons were already drawn. 3 tall West March men held huge mallets. A 2-handed strike from these could smash a man's skull and send him headlong to the bottom. There were 2 spearmen to every swordsman. The assailants would struggle for balance as soon as they topped the wall. It would be easier to thrust him over the side than to attempt a death blow. The swordsman would protect the other 2 only if an enemy warrior managed to evade the thrusting spears. Hanik had drawn his Viron blade at last. The sunlight behind him gilded the expanding edges as he slowly composed it. He did not take pleasure in war, but now felt the certain stirring of his blood and the surging response from the chrysolite. With an audible crackling, like a sudden drawing of sparkling breath, the blade was filled with blue fire. In the air about him danced a million sparks of potential, the thing at once beautiful and frightening. Without the interference of conscious thought, he braced the weapon for the task at hand. It grew heavy with latent power. The men around him, his sergeants and soldiers, had never seen such a display. Involuntarily, they took a step backwards. There was a strange smell about, as of rock struck by a thunderbolt. The air was suddenly dry and warm, as if the moisture had been drawn from it. Hanik turned his head to glance at them. His jaw was set, his eyes aglow with the reflection of the blade. They gasped at the transformation. Further down the wall, Bior, Jumiel, and 8 more Virons stood ready, looking about them for the first warrior to cross the battlements. They raised their blades to the sky, and a shout went up from their open mouths not heard in my role for many centuries. Hanik shouted with them, the cry of blood and violence, of war and fierce defiance. The hewing, scything dance of death began. The defenders struck and struck again and again till they lost all thought or count of the blows, and the desperate struggle became a simple execution of what they had learned during training. Lunge forward, stay in formation, pull back, clear the spearhead, while the swords flashed dangerously close. Lunge once more. Comrades fell around them, mostly to arrows from the enemy bowmen, but reserves stood ready to replace the wounded and exhausted. Into the afternoon, the first assault raged on, with fresh attackers streaming over the beach to join the battle. At the gatehouse, the barbarian effort was faltering, with their retreat and reinforcements cut off by the raging fire in the forge, and the fiendish skill of the defenders on top of the wall. Few warriors remained to scale the ladders by the afternoon watch. The battering ram they had brought up to smash the gate lay unmanned on the ground. Pockets of archers kept shooting arrows at whatever moved on top of the defenses, but their efforts were erratic and ineffective. Hanik ordered his men to take up their bows once more. He selected a century of the least battered and sent him off to reinforce Bior's command where the heaviest fighting still raged. A wide-eyed boy handed him a rag. Hanik squatted down and drew a sleeve across his face. He leaned forward till his forehead touched the hilt of his blade. Blood trickled through his fingers to spatter on the rough stone. He realized suddenly why he had been given the rag. A blow had grazed his temples at some stage, but he had not had an opportunity to pay attention to it. He turned to find the boy.
Water. Get me the water skin.
He was amazed to find his mouth so dry. The leather bag was thrust into his hand, smooth and cold to the touch. An arrow whistled past. He removed the stopper and drank deeply. Then he wet the rag and wiped his brow with it. With a sigh, he handed back the skin.
Let the men empty this, then go fill it in the courtyard.
The boy nodded and scurried off. Hanik rose up to see how the others fared. Bior's men at the far end were under pressure. The fighting there raged on unabated. His reinforcements had almost reached the struggle. In the port, the buildings were still smoldering. Many war canoes had caught fire also, being pressed so closely together, and were floating like blazing logs on the water. A heavy, oily smoke was spreading over the entire island. In the center of the defensive line, Jumil's sentries were comfortably holding their own. There was a lull in the attack, flowing over from the lack of support at the gatehouse section.
Sergeant,
Sir,
find Captain Jumil and tell him to send a fresh sentry to the western wall.
More and more Amul warriors were crossing to the far side of the island, away from the smoke and carnage at Angen, to join the fierce fighting in Bjor's section. If significant numbers could cross the wall there, the first line of defense would be lost. Enemy behind the wall would make the position at the gatehouse untenable. The bearded Viron captain was in the thick of the fight, supported by 2 others wielding the darting blades. They fought as one man, moving in perfect harmony, thrusting and parrying, slicing through the defenses of their assailants with apparent ease. Not a blow was wasted, not a man isolated and exposed to enemy weapons. In the middle of the western wall they kept up the incredible spectacle of defiance, while hundreds of battle-mad, screaming southerners broke about them like waves before the high wind. The Inrathians took heart, surging forward also to clear the battlements. A dreadful press developed on top of the wall. Amul, not able to gain a foothold, leaped like monkeys to land on their own comrades or enemy soldiers, hacking, clawing in a frenzy of rage and bloodlust. One of Bior's Viron went down, an arrow protruding from his neck. The captain roared and felled two opponents with his next blow. His face was red with exertion and rage. Around him a vaporous mist rose from the stones. The blade moved like a living thing, ringing now with each stroke, drawing its potency from the air, from the stones, from its master and Myril itself. It was the moment of crisis. Bior felt it. The wall could be lost before sunset if the Amul was not dislodged soon. His men were tiring, faltering, their gaze filled with endless droves of fresh attackers rushing the wall. He pulled back for a moment to catch his breath. Enemy warriors surged into the gap. A shout behind him broke through the noise.
Reinforcements, sir!
It was a sergeant from Hunnick's section. Behind him stood 100 men. Another 100 moved in from Jumil's section.
Warm them up to the right.
His voice was hoarse, and he had trouble to make the man understand what he shouted. He stretched out his arm to the right. The sergeant motioned to his men and sprinted away. Bior turned to Jumil's century.
Warm up here.
Once again he had to motion with his arm. The men halted to his left.
Where's the trumpeter?
The man was dragged through the ranks, bespattered with blood and one arm hanging limp.
On the charge!
Clear and proud the notes rang out. Immediately the shout was taken up by all the Inrathian soldiers. Forward they pressed, till there was no room to swing a sword. Forward still, locked in a shoving match with their enemies. Suddenly the Amul gave way, toppling backwards over the parapets. The victorious shout drowned out their screams as they plunged headlong to the ground below. Bior did not allow any time for gloating.
Bulls!
His voice was almost entirely gone. The sergeant took up the shouted order till the wall rang with it. The Amul ladders were still in place, secured with ropes and dozens of warriors holding on. Here and there a more valiant barbarian leaped over onto the wall again, but the momentum of the assault was gone. The lone figures were cut down with ease. Horns sounded all over the island. The attackers had had enough. Archers and skirmishers remained to harass the defenders, but the main body of warriors pulled back in haste. They had failed to carry the defenses with their first rush. Many dead and dying southerners were strewn all over the beaches, the fields, the pits, the smoldering harbor. It was time to regroup and plan the night assault. Bior dropped to his knees, breathing heavily. They were alive still and able to carry on the fight. Men sat down gratefully, loosening helms and armor. Bread was passed around. The water skins rose and fell as they moved from hand to hand. Through the pall of smoke, a red sun was settling into the westward ocean. The first day of the Battle of Heron Inrath was ending.